Chapter 19. A concert, a catastrophe, and a confession. Now, this is a little bit of a longer chapter. So I'm going to get started right away. Marilla, can I go over to see Diana just for a minute? Asked Anne, running breathlessly down from the East Gable one February evening. I don't see what you want to be traipsing about after dark for, said Marilla shortly. You and Diana walked home from school together and then stood down there in the snow for half an hour more, your tongues going the whole blessed time clickety-clack. So I don't think you're very badly off to see her again. Marilla, 나 앤네 집에 잠깐 갔다 와도 돼요? 아니 왜? 같이 집에 와놓고선 그리고서는 눈이 있는 데서 밖에서 30분을 your tongue's going the whole blessed time. 혀가 계속 움직이고 clickety clack 딸그락 딸그락. 네, 레이첼님 안녕하세요. But she wants to see me, pleaded Anne. She has something very important to tell me. How do you know she has? Because she just signaled to me from her window. We have arranged a way to signal with our candles and cardboard. We set the candle on the windowsill and make flashes by passing the cardboard back and forth. So many flashes mean a certain thing. It was my idea, Marilla. I'll warrant you it was, said Marilla emphatically. And the next thing you'll be setting fire to the curtains with your signaling nonsense. 어떻게 시그널을 한다 그랬죠? 초를 창문 틀에 놓고 cardboard를 그 앞에다 이렇게 하면 이게 깜깜해지잖아요, 갑자기. 그래서 그거를 여러 번 이렇게 그거를 지나게 하면 무슨 뜻이 있는 거죠. 그래서 5번을 이렇게 오케이. 아직 안 했군요. I'll warrant you it was, said Marilla emphatically, and the next thing you'll be setting fire to the curtains with your signaling nonsense. Oh, we're very careful, Marilla, and it's so interesting. 2 flashes mean, are you there? 3 means yes, and 4, no. 5 mean, 5 mean come over as soon as possible because I have something important to reveal. Diana has just signaled 5 flashes, and I'm really suffering to know what it is. 네. 2번은 거기 있어? 하고 3는 나 여기 있어. 4는 아니, 나 여기 없어. 너무 so ridiculous. 그리고 5는 빨리 와, 나 당장 얘기해 줄 게 있어. Well, you needn't suffer any longer, said Marilla sarcastically. You can go, but you're to be back here in just 10 minutes. Remember that. Anne did remember it and was back in the stipulated time, although probably no mortal will ever know just what it cost her to confine the discussion of Diana's important communication within the limits of 10 minutes. But at least she had made good use of them. Oh, Marilla, what do you think? You know tomorrow is Diana's birthday. Well, her mother told her she could ask me to go home with her from school and stay all night with her. And her cousins are coming over from Newbridge in a big pung sleigh to go to the debating club concert at the hall tomorrow night. And they are going to take Diana and me to the concert, if you'll let me go, that is. You will, won't you, Marilla? Oh, I feel so excited. 네, big pung sleigh. 뭐 타고? 네, 말이 끄는 썰매를 타고 debating 토론 클럽 콘서트를 보러 간대요. 그러니까 토론을 하는 거를 보러 간다는 거죠. 이렇게 막 시도 읽고 토론도 하고. You can calm down then, because you're not going. You're better at home in your own bed. And as for that club concert, it's all nonsense, and little girls should not be allowed to go out to such places at all. I'm sure the debating club is a most respectable affair, pleaded Anne. I'm not saying it isn't. But you're not going to be gadding about to concerts and staying out all hours of the night. Pretty doings for children. I'm surprised that Mrs. Barry's letting Diana go. But it's such a very special occasion, mourned Anne on the verge of tears. 울기 직전이에요. 가지 못하게 해서. Diana has only one birthday in a year. It isn't as if birthdays were common things, Marilla. Prissy Andrews is going to recite Curfew Must Not Ring tonight. That is such a good moral piece. 아주 도덕적인 그거래요. I'm sure it would do me lots of good to hear it, and the choir are going to sing 4 lovely pathetic songs that are pretty near as good as hymns. 아주 애처로운 노래들을 할 건데 그냥 거의 찬송가나 마찬가지래요. And oh, Marilla, the minister is going to take part. Yes, indeed, he is. He's going to give an address. That will be just about the same thing as a sermon. Please, may I go, Marilla? You heard what I said, Anne, didn't you? Take off your boots now and go to bed. It's past 8. There's just one more thing, Marilla, said Anne, with the air of producing the last shot in her locker. Mrs. Barry told Diana that we might sleep in the spare room bed. Think of the honor of your little Anne being put in the spare room bed. 아, 손님을 위한 방에서 잘 수 있다고 한 거예요. 다이아나의 엄마가 It's an honor you'll have to get along without. 그런 영예는 혹은 그런 명예는 없이 지내야 돼. 돼도 되겠어. Go to bed, Anne, and don't let me hear another word out of you. When Anne, with tears rolling over her cheeks, had gone sorrowfully upstairs, Matthew, who had been apparently sound asleep on the lounge during the whole dialogue, opened his eyes and said decidedly, Well now, Marilla, I think you ought to let Anne go. 아, 자고 있었는데? 자고 있는 줄 알았는데? Anne 가게 해주라고. I don't then, retorted Marilla. Who's bringing this child up, Matthew? You or me? 누가 지금 Anne을 키우는 거야? Well now, you, admitted Matthew. Don't interfere then. Well now, I ain't interfering. It ain't interfering to have your own opinion. And my opinion is that you ought to let Anne go. 아, 내가 참견하는 건 아니고 그냥 내 의견이 있는 거는 참견하는 건 아니잖아. 그리고 내 의견은 Anne을 보내라는 거야. You'd think I ought to let Anne go to the moon if she took the notion, I have no doubt, was Marilla's amiable rejoinder. 네, amiable는 정감 있는, 그리고 rejoinder, 답변. I might have let her spend the night with Diana if that was all. But I don't approve of this concert plan. She'd go there and catch cold like as not and have her head filled up with nonsense and excitement. It would unsettle her for a week. I understand that child's disposition and what's good for it better than you, Matthew. 내가 그 아이의 기질을 아는데, Matthew, 너보다 더 잘 알아. 잠만 자는 건 내가 생각해 보겠지만, 허락하겠지만, 이 콘서트는 정말, 정신을 못 차릴 거야, 일주일 동안은, 갔다 오면. I think you ought to let Anne go, repeated Matthew firmly. Argument was not his strong point, but holding fast to his opinion certainly was. 네, 언쟁은 그의 장점은 아니었지만, 의견을 한번 가졌으면, 그거를 끝까지 굳건히 유지하는 거는 그의 장점이었다. Marilla gave a gasp of helplessness and took refuge in silence. The next morning, when Anne was washing the breakfast dishes in the pantry, Matthew paused on his way out to the barn to say to Marilla again, I think you ought to let Anne go, Marilla. 계속 똑같은 말만 하죠. For a moment, Marilla looked things not lawful to be uttered. 말로 하면은 이거는 법적이 아니다. 그러니까 욕을 할 것 같은 막 얼굴을 했다는 거죠. Then she yielded to the inevitable and said tartly. Inevitable, 불가피한. Yielded, 양보했다. Very well, she can go since nothing else will please you. Anne flew out of the pantry, dripping dishcloth in hand. Oh, Marilla, Marilla, say those blessed words again. I guess once is enough to say them. This is Matthew's doings, and I wash my hands of it. If you catch pneumonia sleeping in a strange bed or coming out of that hot hall in the middle of the night, don't blame me, blame Matthew. Anne Shirley, you're dripping greasy water all over the floor. I never saw such a careless child. Oh, I know I'm a great trial to you, Marilla, said Anne repentantly. I make so many mistakes. But then, just think of all the mistakes I don't make, although I might. I'll get some sand and scrub up the spots before I go to school. Oh, Marilla, my heart was just set on going to that concert. I never was to a concert in my life. And when the other girls talk about them in school, I feel so out of it. You don't know just how I felt about it, but you see, Matthew did. Matthew understands me, and it's so nice to be understood, Marilla. Anne was too excited to do herself justice as to lessons that morning in school. 너무 신나가지고 공부를 제대로 못했다는 거죠. Gilbert Blythe spelled her down in class and left her clear out of sight in mental arithmetic. Anne's consequent humiliation was less than it might have been, however, in view of the concert and the spare room bed. She and Diana talked so constantly about it all day that with a stricter teacher than Mr. Phillips, dire disgrace must inevitably have been their portion. 하루 종일 너무 이 컨셉트에 대해서 떠들어서 미스터 필립스보다 더 스트릭트한 선생님이었으면 분명히 수치 혹은 망신을 당했을 거예요. Anne felt that she could not have borne it if she had not been going to the concert, for nothing else was discussed that day in school. The Avonlea Debating Club, which met fortnightly all winter, had had several smaller free entertainments, but this was to be a big affair, admission 10 cents in aid of the library. The Avonlea young people had been practicing for weeks, and all the scholars were especially interested in it by reason of older brothers and sisters who were going to take part. Everybody in school over 9 years of age expected to go, except Carrie Sloane, whose father shared Marilla's opinions about small girls going out to night concerts. 9살 이상의 아이들은 다 가는 거였어요. 캐리 슬론만 빼놓고. 왜? 왜냐하면 그녀의 아빠도 Marilla의 생각과 일치했기 때문에 작은 여자애들이 밤에 그렇게 돌아다니면 안 된다. Carrie Sloane cried into her grammar all the afternoon and felt that life was not worth living. For Anne, the real excitement began with the dismissal of school and increased therefrom in crescendo until it reached to a crash of positive ecstasy in the concert itself. They had a perfectly elegant tea, and then came the delicious occupation of dressing in Diana's little room upstairs. Diana did Anne's front hair in the new pompadour style, and Anne tied Diana's bows with the especial knack she possessed, and they experimented with at least half a dozen different ways of arranging their back hair. 팜포도어는 머리 이렇게 올리는 말인 것 같아요. At last they were ready, cheeks scarlet and eyes glowing with excitement. True, Anne could not help a little pain when she contrasted her plain black tam and shapeless, tight-sleeved, homemade gray cloth coat with Diana's jaunty fur cap and smart little jacket. 다이아나의 옷과 비교해 보니까 조금 마음이 안 좋았다는 거죠. But she remembered in time that she had an imagination and could use it. 하지만 때마침 자기는 상상력이 있다는 걸 기억하고 상상력이 있고 그걸 쓸 수 있다는 것을 기억했습니다. Then Diana's cousins, the Murrays from Newbridge, came. They all crowded into the big pung sleigh among straw and furry robes. Anne reveled in the drive to the hall, slipping along over the satin-smooth roads with the snow crisping under the runners. There was a magnificent sunset, and the snowy hills and deep blue water of the St. Lawrence Gulf seemed to rim in the splendor, like a huge bowl of pearl and sapphire brimmed with wine and fire. Tinkles of sleigh bells and distant laughter that seemed like the mirth of wood elves came from every quarter. Oh, Diana, breathed Anne, squeezing Diana's mittened hand under the fur robe. Isn't it all like a beautiful dream? Do I really look the same as usual? I feel so different that it seems to me it must show in my looks. You look awfully nice, said Diana, who, having just received a compliment from one of her cousins, felt that she ought to pass it on. You've got the loveliest color. The program that night was a series of thrills for at least one listener in the audience, and as Anne assured Diana, every succeeding thrill was thrillier than the last. 네, 그 밤의 프로그램은 전율의 연속이었습니다. 적어도 한 사람에게는, 시청자 한 사람에게는. 그리고 every thrill, 그 다음에 오는 thrill는 더 신나고, 더 thrillier, 더 전율을 주는. When Prissy Andrews, attired in a new pink silk waist with a string of pearls about her smooth white throat and real carnations in her hair, rumor whispered that the master had sent all the way to town for them for her, climbed the slimy ladder, dark without one ray of light, Anne shivered in luxurious sympathy. Shivered. 그죠? When the choir sang far above the gentle daisies, Anne gazed at the ceiling as if it were frescoed with angels. When Sam Sloane proceeded to explain and illustrate how Zachary said a hen, Anne laughed until people sitting near her laughed too, more out of sympathy with her than with amusement at a selection that was rather threadbare even in Avonlea. And when Mr. Phillips gave Mark Antony's oration over the dead body of Caesar in the most heart-stirring tones, looking at Prissy Andrews at the end of every sentence, Anne felt that she could rise and mutiny on the spot if but one Roman citizen led the way. 알리시아님, 안녕하세요. 늦게라도 오셔서 감사합니다. Only one number on the program failed to interest her. 한 프로그램만 관심을 끄는데 실패했다. 누구겠어요? When Gilbert Blythe recited Bingen on the Rhine, Anne picked up Rhoda Murray's library book and read it until he had finished, when she sat rigidly stiff and motionless while Diana clapped her hands until they tingled. Gilbert가 뭐라고 어쩌고저쩌고 할 때 혼자서 책을 읽었어요. It was 11 when they got home, sated with dissipation, but with the exceeding sweet pleasure of talking it all over still to come. Everybody seemed asleep, and the house was dark and silent. Anne and Diana tiptoed into the parlor, a long, narrow room out of which the spare room opened. It was pleasantly warm and dimly lighted by the embers of a fire in the grate. "Let's undress here," said Diana. "It's so nice and warm." "Hasn't it been a delightful time?" sighed Anne rapturously. "It must be splendid to get up and recite there. Do you suppose we will ever be asked to do it, Diana?" "Yes, of course, someday. They're always wanting the big scholars to recite. Gilbert Blythe does often, and he's only 2 years older than us." 2살 더 많다겠죠? "Oh, Anne, how could you pretend not to listen to him when he came to the line, 'There's another, not a sister'? He looked right down at you." "길버트를 어떻게 안 듣는 척을 할 수가 있어?" "There's another, not a sister. 어떤 다른 사람이 있어. 하지만 그녀는 나의 sister가 아니야." 그 말을 하는데 딱 너를 쳐다보는 거야. "Diana," said Anne with dignity, "you are my bosom friend, but I cannot allow even you to speak to me of that person." "Diana, 너는 나의 절친이지만 너도 그에 대해서 나에게 말하는 것 내가 허용을 할 수가 없어." Are you ready for bed? Let's run a race and see who'll get to the bed first. 아, 감사합니다, 배청님. 네, 배에 힘을 주면 되고 훈련을 많이 하셔야 돼요. 오케이? 저는 녹음을 정말 많이 합니다. 오늘도 이거 끝나고 녹음을 할 수 있을까요? 네, 일이 있어요. 우리 아버지 회사를 위해 녹음할 게 매일 있어요, 거의. 그러기 때문에 항상 이거를 수십 년을 하면 이렇게 될 수 있습니다. The suggestion appealed to Diana. 누가 더 침대로 빨리 갈 수 있는지 경쟁을 하자. The two little white-clad figures flew down the long room, through the spare room door, and bounded on the bed at the same moment. And then something moved beneath them. There was a gasp and a cry, and somebody said in muffled accents, "Merciful goodness!" muffled는 이렇게 소리가 이렇게 이불 속에 있어서 muffled 됐다는 거죠. Anne and Diana were never able to tell just how they got off that bed and out of the room. They only knew that after one frantic rush, they found themselves tiptoeing shiveringly upstairs. "Oh, who was it? What was it?" whispered Anne, her teeth chattering with cold and fright. 이거예요. "It was Aunt Josephine," said Diana, gasping with laughter. "Oh, Anne, it was Aunt Josephine! However she came to be there! Oh, and I know she will be furious! It's dreadful. It's really dreadful. But did you ever know anything so funny, Anne? Who's your Aunt Josephine?" "She's father's aunt, and she lives in Charlottetown. She's awfully old, 70 anyhow, and I don't believe she was ever a little girl. We were expecting her out for a visit, but not so soon. She's awfully prim and proper, and she'll scold dreadfully about this, I know. Well, we'll have to sleep with Minnie May, and you can't think how she kicks." 네. 누가 거기 침대 속에 있었죠? 아빠의 이모 혹은 고모. 너무 늙고 고지식하고 너무 반듯해가지고 한 번도 소녀였을 리가 없대요. Miss Josephine Barry did not appear at the early breakfast the next morning. Mrs. Barry smiled kindly at the two little girls. Did you have a good time last night? I tried to stay awake until you came home, for I wanted to tell you Aunt Josephine had come and that you would have to go upstairs after all, but I was so tired I fell asleep. I hope you didn't disturb your aunt, Diana. Diana preserved a discreet silence, but she and Anne exchanged furtive smiles of guilty amusement across the table. Anne hurried home after breakfast, and so remained in blissful ignorance of the disturbance, which presently resulted in the Barry household until the late afternoon, when she went down to Mrs. Lynde's on an errand for Marilla. 네. 버벅 될 수 있죠. 한국말도 한번 읽어보세요. 한국말을 읽어보시고 녹음해보시고 들어보세요. 들어봤을 때 한국말은 버벅대지 않으시나요? 그럼 버벅 안 되시고 되게 유창하게 자연스럽게 읽으신다면 that's awesome. You should be like a 성우 or a 배우. 하지만 한국말도 모국어인데도 다 잘 읽는 건 아니거든요. 그쵸? 그런데 영어는 얼마나 더 힘들겠어요. 그쵸? You have to practice. So you and Diana nearly frightened poor old Miss Barry to death last night? Said Mrs. Lynde severely, but with a twinkle in her eye. Mrs. Barry was here a few minutes ago on her way to Carmody. She's feeling real worried over it. Old Miss Barry was in a terrible temper when she got up this morning, and Josephine Barry's temper is no joke, I can tell you that. She wouldn't speak to Diana at all. 할머니의 성질은 장난이 아니야. It wasn't Diana's fault, said Anne contritely. It was mine. I suggested racing to see who would get into bed first. I knew it, said Mrs. Lynde with the exultation of a correct guesser. 똑바로 알아맞춘 사람의 의기양양함을 가지고 I knew it 했어요. I knew that idea came out of your head. Well, it's made a nice lot of trouble, that's what. Old Miss Barry came out to stay for a month, but she declares she won't stay another day and is going right back to town tomorrow, Sunday and all as it is. She'd have gone today if they could have taken her. She had promised to pay for a quarter's music lessons for Diana, but now she is determined to do nothing at all for such a tomboy. tomboy는 남자 같은 여자이죠. Oh, I guess they had a lively time of it there this morning. The Barrys must feel cut up. Old Miss Barry is rich, and they'd like to keep on the good side of her. Of course, Mrs. Barry didn't say just that to me, but I'm a pretty good judge of human nature, that's what. 네, 미스 조세피는 돈이 많아서 아주 잘 보여야 되는데, 잘 보여야 되는 것 같다고. 그렇게 얘기는 안 했지만 내가 사람을 잘 알봐. I'm such an unlucky girl, mourned Anne. I'm always getting into scrapes myself and getting my best friends, people I'd shed my heart's blood for, into them too. Can you tell me why it is so, Mrs. Lynde? 내가 왜 이렇게 trouble에 많이 what does that mean? Getting into scrapes. 왜 이렇게 많이 말썽을 부릴까요? 나만 말썽 부리는 게 아니라 나의 절친 내가 제일 좋아하는 친구까지. It's because you're too heedless and impulsive, child. That's what. 너무 조심스럽지 않고 너무 충동적이라서 그래. You never stop to think. Whatever comes into your head to say or do, you say or do it without a moment's reflection. 머리에 생각이 들자마자 무슨 말이나 행동이 머리에 생각이 들자마자 바로 말을 해. 혹은 바로 행동을 해. Oh, but that's the best of it, protested Anne. Something just flashes into your mind, so exciting, and you must out with it. If you stop to think it over, you spoil it all. Haven't you never felt that yourself, Mrs. Lynde? No, Mrs. Lynde had not. She shook her head sagely. 제인님도 안녕하세요. You must learn to think a little, Anne, that's what. The proverb you need to go by is look before you leap, especially into spare room beds. Mrs. Lynde laughed comfortably over her mild joke, but Anne remained pensive. She saw nothing to laugh at in the situation, which to her eyes appeared very serious. When she left Mrs. Lynde's, she took her way across the crusted fields to Orchard Slope. Diana met her at the kitchen door. Your Aunt Josephine was very cross about it, wasn't she? Whispered Anne. Yes, answered Diana, stifling a giggle with an apprehensive glance over her shoulder at the closed sitting room door. 네, 여기 배에 힘이 없으면 절대로 한숨으로 할 수가 없어요. 그쵸? 근데 이거를 stifling a giggle with an apprehensive glance over her shoulder 이렇게 할 수가 없단 말이에요. 왜냐하면 맞아. 다이아나가 답했다. 웃음을 참으면서 그리고 쳐다보면서 어쩌고 저쩌고 어쩌고 저쩌고 그렇게 말을 yes를 그렇게 대답했다는 건데 이거를 숨을 쉬면서 천천히 하면 이거는 그 맛이 절대로 안 납니다. 감사합니다, 제이님. All right. She was fairly dancing with rage, Anne. Oh, how she scolded. scold는 혼내다. She said I was the worst behaved girl she ever saw and that my parents ought to be ashamed of the way they had brought me up. She says she won't stay, and I'm sure I don't care. But father and mother do. 더 이상 안 있겠다고 하시는데 나는 상관없어. 하지만 엄마랑 아빠는 상관하셔. Why didn't you tell them it was my fault? demanded Anne. 왜 내 잘못이라고 하지 않았어? It's likely I'd do such a thing, isn't it? said Diana with just scorn. I'm no telltale, Anne Shirley, and anyhow, I was just as much to blame as you. 내가 고자쟁이가 아니야. 그리고 나도 똑같이 너만큼 잘못했어. Well, I'm going in to tell her myself, said Anne resolutely. Diana stared. Anne Shirley, you'd never. Why, she'll eat you alive. Don't frighten me any more than I'm frightened, implored Anne. I'd rather walk up to a cannon's mouth. 차라리 대포 입구로 가겠어. But I've got to do it, Diana. It was my fault, and I've got to confess. 내 잘못이었고 고백해야 돼. I've had practice in confessing, fortunately. 다행히 내가 고백하는 거 많이 연습해봤어. 내가 많은 경험이 있어. Well, she's in the room, said Diana. You can go in if you want to. I wouldn't dare, and I don't believe you'll do a bit of good. With this encouragement, Anne bearded the lion in its den, that is to say, walked resolutely up to the sitting room door and knocked faintly. Toc. A sharp "Come in!" followed. Miss Josephine Barry, thin, prim, and rigid. rigid는 딱딱하다는 거예요. 그냥 이렇게가 아니라 완전 was knitting fiercely by the fire, her wrath quite unappeased and her eyes snapping through her gold-rimmed glasses. She wheeled around in her chair, expecting to see Diana, and beheld a white-faced girl whose great eyes were brimmed up with a mixture of desperate courage and shrinking terror. 다이아나일 줄 알았는데 얼굴 하얀 여자아이가 있었어요. eyes는 큰 눈이 desperate, 간절한 용기가와 움츠리는 공포가 찬 큰 눈으로 쳐다보는. 네, Miss Josephine은 knitting fiercely, 그냥 서서히 뜨개질하는 게 아니라 fiercely 이렇게 하고 있어요. Speaking of knitting, 제가 요거 뜬 건데 어떠신가요? Do you like my cowl? 이렇게 이거는 scarf가 아니고 완전히 막혀 있는 거를 cowl이라고 합니다. 네, 제가 뜬 거예요. Anyway, who are you? demanded Miss Josephine Barry without ceremony. I'm Anne of Green Gables, said the small visitor tremulously, clasping her hands with her characteristic gesture. And I've come to confess, if you please. 네. characteristic gesture, 그녀만의 gesture, 항상 하는 gesture라는 거예요. 감사합니다. 네. Confess what? That it was all my fault about jumping into bed on you last night. I suggested it. Diana would never have thought of such a thing, I am sure. Diana is a very ladylike girl, Miss Barry, so you must see how unjust it is to blame her. Oh, I must, hey? I rather think Diana did her share of the jumping, at least. Such carryings on in a respectable house. But we were only in fun, persisted Anne. I think you ought to forgive us, Miss Barry, now that we've apologized. And anyhow, please forgive Diana and let her have her music lessons. Diana's heart is set on her music lessons, Miss Barry, and I know too well what it is to set your heart on a thing and not get it. 마음을 먹었다는 거죠. Heart is set on her music lessons. 음악 레슨을 받는 거에 완전히 마음을 먹었는데 나도 알아요. 뭘 정말 원하고 기대했는데 and 못 받는 거를. 네. If you must be cross with anyone, cross는 화난 거. Be cross with me. I've been so used in my early days to having people cross at me that I can endure it much better than Diana can. 화나야 되면 저에게 화내세요. 나는 used to 익숙해졌다. 나는 어렸을 때부터 하도 사람들이 많이 나에게 화낸 거에 익숙해져서 내가 훨씬 다이아나보다 잘 견딜 수 있어요. Much of the snap had gone out of the old lady's eyes by this time and was replaced by a twinkle of amused interest. But she still said severely. 이제 화가 amused, 재밌어하는 관심으로 바뀌었어요. I don't think it is any excuse for you that you were only in fun. Little girls never indulged in that kind of fun when I was young. You don't know what it is to be awakened out of a sound sleep after a long and arduous journey by two great girls coming bounce down on you. I don't know, but I can imagine, said Anne eagerly. 아주 고온이 자고 있는데 아주 힘든 여행 끝에 갑자기 이따만한 여자애들이 와서 점프를 하는 게 어떨지 너는 모를 거야. I don't know, but I can imagine. 난 모르지만 난 상상은 할 수 있어요. I'm sure it must have been very disturbing. 정말 disturbing이었을 것 같아요. But then there is our side of it too. 하지만 우리의 입장도 있어요. Have you any imagination, Miss Barry? 상상력 있나요? If you have, just put yourself in our place. We didn't know there was anybody in that bed, and you nearly scared us to death. 우리는 아무도 침대에 있는지 몰랐는데 당신이 우리 놀라서 죽을 뻔했어요. It was simply awful the way we felt. And then we couldn't sleep in the spare room after being promised. 약속 받았는데 그 방에서 객실에서 잘 수도 없었고. I suppose you're used to sleeping in spare rooms, but just imagine what you would feel like if you were a little orphan girl who had never had such an honor. 미스 조세피는 항상 그렇게 남의 spare room, 남아있는 방에서 자는 거가 익숙하시겠지만 당신이 고아 여자아이라고 생각해 보세요. 그런 영예가 없었는 한 번도 그런 영예를 누린 적이 없는데 갑자기 자도 된다고 했는데 갑자기 못 자서. All the snap had gone by this time. Miss Barry actually laughed, a sound which caused Diana, waiting in speechless anxiety in the kitchen outside, to give a great gasp of relief. 네, 이제 엄청 웃었어요. I'm afraid my imagination is a little rusty. 내 상상력이 조금 녹슬었어. It is so long since I used it, she said. I dare say your claim to sympathy is just as strong as mine. It all depends on the way we look at it. Sit down here and tell me about yourself. I'm very sorry I can't. 여기 와 앉아서 너에 대해서 좀 얘기해봐. I'm very sorry I can't, said Anne firmly. I would like to because you seem like an interesting lady. 흥미로운 분이신 것 같아서 내가 그러고 싶지만 and you might even be a kindred spirit, although you don't look very much like it. 그리고 kindred spirit는 마음이 맞는 사람이죠. 마음이 맞는 분이신 것 같지만 그렇게 생기지는 않았지만 마음이 맞는 분이신 것 같기도 해요. But it is my duty to go home to Miss Marilla Cuthbert. 하지만 저는 집에 가야 합니다. Miss Marilla Cuthbert is a very kind lady who has taken me to bring up properly. She is doing her best, but it is very discouraging work. 나를 제대로 키우려고 하고 계시지만 정말 맥 빠지는 일입니다. You must not blame her because I jumped on the bed. But before I go, I do wish you would tell me if you will forgive Diana and stay just as long as you meant to in Avonlea. 하지만 제가 가기 전에 다이아나를 용서하실 수 있는지 얘기를 꼭 해주세요. I think perhaps I will if you will come over and talk to me occasionally, said Miss Barry. That evening, Miss Barry gave Diana a silver bangle bracelet and told the senior members of the household that she had unpacked her valise. I've made up my mind to stay simply for the sake of getting better acquainted with that Anne girl, she said frankly. She amuses me, and at my time of life, an amusing person is a rarity. Marilla's only comment when she heard the story was, I told you so. This was for Matthew's benefit. Miss Barry stayed her month out and over. She was a more agreeable guest than usual, for Anne kept her in good humor. They became firm friends. When Miss Barry went away, she said, Remember, you Anne girl, when you come to town, you're to visit me, and I'll put you in my very sparest spare room bed to sleep. 어, 타운으로 오면, 도시로 오면, 나 보러 와. 그리고 내가 제일 남는 제일 남는 객실방, 제일 좋은 남는 방이라는 거죠. 제일 좋은 객실. Miss Barry was a kindred spirit after all, Anne confided to Marilla. You wouldn't think so to look at her, but she is. You don't find it right out at first, as in Matthew's case, but after a while you come to see it. Matthew처럼 바로 알지는 못하지만 곧 있으면 알게 돼요. 마음 정말 맞는 사람이에요. Kindred spirits are not so scarce as I used to think. It's splendid to find out there are so many of them in the world. 전에 생각했던 것처럼 kindred spirit는 그렇게 드물지 않은 것 같아요. Alright. 낭독하고 싶은데 진짜 배에 힘 엄청 들어가요. 그렇죠. 배에 살은 많은데 힘은 저도 살이 많은데 하도 익숙해져서 그냥 힘이 딱 들어가요. 근데 힘을 주는지도 사실은 저는 모르겠는데 이게 누워서 막 부르잖아요, 우리 딸들 혹은 말을 할 때. 그러면 이게 배에 힘이 확 들어가는 게 그때 느껴져요, 더. 죄송해요, 무서우셨다면. 네. 네. 현기증이 오죠. 그러니까 뭐냐 하면 숨을 제대로 들여 마시지 않은 상태에서 많이 뱉으니까 당연히 어지럽고 현기증이 오겠죠. 그쵸? So 네. 그래서 잘 낭독하고 싶은데 So I think one of the reasons 제가 잘 읽을 수 있는 이유는 first of all 이 책을 읽을 때 어떤 부분들은 되게 old 책이잖아요. It's really old and that's why some sentences I'm not familiar with. 그런 말을 해본 적도 없고 들어본 적도 없기 때문에 그럴 때는 막 떠듬어요. 그쵸? But 하도 책을 많이 읽어봤기 때문에 웬만한 거는 읽어도 뭐가 나올지 예상이 된다는 거죠. Right? So what I would recommend is 이런 거부터 연습하지 마시고 쉬운 거 읽어보세요. 그리고 책을 누가 읽는 거를 봤을 때 you can tell 그 사람이 이해를 하고 읽는 건지 아니면 읽긴 하는데 무슨 뜻인지 전혀 모르는 사람 같다. 이럴 수 있다는 거죠. 근데 이거를 내가 뜻을 알면 감정이 당연히 들어가겠죠. 어떻게 말을 해야 되는지. 그쵸? 그러니깐 이게 연기도 나올 수 있는 거고. Right? So 그냥 단순히 잘 읽는다는 거는 단순히 그냥 발음이 좋다 이거는 아닌 것 같아요. So what I would recommend is 한국 책도 내가 읽어 보시는 거예요. 들어 보시고 '내가 잘 읽나?' 그래서 연습을 많이 해 보시는 거죠. Right? So I think if you've read a lot 되게 쉽게 올 거예요. And so work your way up. 당연하죠. 제가 책을 많이 안 읽었더라면 어렸을 때 진짜 I've read so much. I've read so much. 지금은 and so much fiction too. 한 5년 전까지만 해도 fiction만 읽었던 것 같아요, 거의. 이제는 I don't read fiction. So I love this time once a week with you guys. 왜냐하면 fiction을 제가 따로는 너무 그동안 많이 읽어 가지고 안 읽게 되는데 너무 좋네요. So I only read nonfiction these days. But 하도 많이 읽어 가지고 문맥이랑 이런 거가 다 잘 되니깐 네 이게 잘 되겠죠? I know. 그래서 우리 이승만 님이 무섭다고 하신 것 같아요. 너무 신나게. 근데 you know what? 우리 딸들을 위해 우리 특히 막 our second daughter를 위해서 밤에 이거를 제가 읽어 준단 말이에요. 그래 가지고 I'm over here with my daughters chapter 23. 그래서 먼저 읽어 주고 있는데 밤에 읽어 줘요, 자기 전에. And then 자요. 얘는 잠이 들어요. And then so my other daughter goes, "엄마 인제 그만해도 될 것 같아." 왜냐면 자는데도 제가 너무 열정적으로 읽으니까. 네. 읽을 때는 그냥 그냥 막 "Miss Berry was a kindred spirit after all. You wouldn't think so to look at her, but she is. You don't find it right out at first, as in Matthew's case, but after a while." 이렇게는 안 읽어지는 것 같아요. So 그 캐릭터가 어떤 사람인지 파악해 가지고 파악이 되니깐 그 사람을 인 것처럼 네 읽어지는 것 같아요. Alright, so I would start with a much easier book and then 거기에서 인제 되게 그 레벨에서 계속 하시다가 그게 정말 '나 인제 정말 잘하는 것 같아.' 하면 level up. 거기서 또 쭉 가시고. Okay? Alright, thank you for listening. Have a great night. I'll see you next week.